The officer thought he had already won. The flashing lights painted the quiet street in alternating waves of red and blue, reflecting across the windshield of the old gray sedan parked neatly along the curb. It was nearly midnight in the outskirts of Arlington Heights, the kind of neighborhood where most porch lights were already dark and the sound of tires on pavement carried for blocks. Officer Daniel Kruger stepped out of his cruiser slowly, adjusting the collar of his jacket as if the entire street belonged to him. In a way, tonight, it did. He had already decided how this was going to end. The radio on his shoulder crackled faintly, but he ignored it. His attention was fixed on the man sitting calmly behind the wheel of the gray sedan. No panic, no frantic movements, just waiting. Kruger didn't like that. Most people, when pulled over this late, already started explaining themselves before he even reached the window. This man hadn't moved. Kruger walked forward deliberately, his boots striking the asphalt with authority. The neighborhood camera across the street blinked its small red light. Recording. But that wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was the way the driver looked straight ahead instead of nervously checking the mirrors. A man in his mid-50s, clean coat, gray hair, calm posture, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Kruger leaned down toward the open window. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Just control. The man turned slowly, meeting the officer's eyes. His voice was steady. "Good evening, officer." Kruger's jaw tightened slightly. People who stayed calm irritated him. "License and registration," he repeated, slower this time. The man nodded once and reached into his coat pocket carefully, pulling out a thin leather wallet. Inside was a driver's license. He handed it over without hesitation. Kruger glanced at it quickly. Ethan Cole. Address listed in Washington, D.C. Kruger frowned. "What are you doing in Arlington Heights this late, Mr. Cole?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down the street for a moment, as if considering something far more important than the question. Then he said quietly, "Driving." Kruger exhaled sharply through his nose. "Funny." He straightened slightly and tapped the roof of the car. "You were drifting over the center line back there." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I wasn't." The silence that followed was thin and sharp. Kruger leaned back down slowly, resting one hand on the doorframe. "Are you arguing with me?" "No," Ethan replied calmly. "I'm correcting you." Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Someone had started watching. Kruger's voice hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." Ethan blinked once. "Am I being detained?" Kruger smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You will be if you keep asking questions." The man inside the car remained perfectly still. Most people at this point would already be scrambling to unbuckle their seatbelt. Ethan simply looked at him, studying him, measuring something. Kruger suddenly felt the faint itch of irritation crawling up his neck. He hated that look, the look of someone who didn't feel small yet. "Step out of the vehicle." This time the command echoed across the quiet street. Another porch light came on, 2 houses down. Ethan finally opened the door slowly and stepped out. He moved carefully, deliberately, like someone used to people watching his movements. Kruger immediately guided him toward the rear of the car, hands on the trunk. "Spread your feet." Ethan complied, still calm, still quiet. Kruger began the pat-down, more aggressive than necessary. Wallet already checked. No weapons, no alcohol smell, no drugs, nothing. And that made it worse, because now Kruger needed a reason. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Kruger asked again. "Meeting someone." "At midnight?" "Yes." Kruger leaned closer. "Who?" Ethan looked down the street again. "Someone important." Kruger chuckled. "Oh, I'm sure." He walked back toward the driver's side of the car, shining his flashlight across the interior. Nothing suspicious, no open containers, no clutter. Just a clean car and a small folder resting on the passenger seat. Kruger opened the door and grabbed the folder. Ethan spoke calmly from behind him. "I wouldn't do that." Kruger turned slowly. "Oh, really? That's private." Kruger flipped the folder open anyway. Inside were printed documents, legal documents, official looking. But he didn't bother reading them carefully. Instead, he closed the folder and tossed it back onto the passenger seat. "Looks boring." Then he turned back toward Ethan. "Here's the problem, Mr. Cole." He paced slowly. "You say you weren't drifting. You say you're just driving. You're meeting someone. Important." Kruger leaned in slightly. "But none of that sounds very believable at midnight." Ethan's voice stayed even. "Believability doesn't change facts." Kruger's patience snapped just a little. "You know what I think?" He pointed toward the car. "I think you're hiding something." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Based on what?" Kruger didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, run ID." He read the license information. Static filled the silence. Across the street, someone had stepped onto their porch, watching openly now. Ethan noticed, but he said nothing. The radio crackled again. "Stand by." Kruger folded his arms. "You federal or something?" he asked sarcastically. "No." "You a lawyer?" "No." Kruger smirked. "Well, you talk like one." Ethan gave a small shrug. "I talk like someone who reads." The officer laughed once. "Yeah, that'll help you tonight." The radio crackled again, but the voice that came through this time was different, less casual, more careful. "Unit 34. Confirm the name again." Kruger rolled his eyes and repeated it. "Ethan Cole." Silence followed, longer this time. Kruger glanced at Ethan, still calm, still watching. Then the radio voice returned. Quieter now. "Unit 34. Stand by for supervisor confirmation." Kruger frowned. "For what?" But dispatch didn't answer. Instead, 2 houses down, someone lifted their phone, recording. The red and blue lights continued pulsing across the street like a slow heartbeat. Kruger shifted his weight. Something about the air had changed, but he couldn't explain why. So he doubled down. He stepped closer to Ethan again. "You know what?" he said. "I'm thinking we should search the vehicle." Ethan's expression didn't move. "You don't have probable cause." Kruger smiled wider. "I'll decide that." Another pause. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "If you continue down this path..." Kruger cut him off. "What? You'll file a complaint?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "No, that's not the concern." Kruger leaned closer. "Then what is?" For the first time, Ethan's voice carried the faintest hint of gravity. "The timing." Kruger frowned. "What timing?" Ethan looked down the street again, then back at the officer. "Because someone is about to arrive." Kruger scoffed. "Oh yeah? Your important friend?" Ethan nodded once. "Yes." Kruger chuckled. "Well, they can wait." But down the quiet street, headlights had just turned the corner, and they weren't slowing down. The headlights approached slowly, not the hurried, uncertain speed of a lost driver, not the relaxed crawl of someone heading home. This vehicle moved with deliberate precision. Officer Kruger noticed it immediately. Of course he did. Years on patrol had trained him to notice every set of headlights entering a scene, but something about these lights was different, too steady, too intentional. The black SUV rolled down the street, its engine almost silent. It wasn't rushing toward the flashing police cruiser. It wasn't hesitating either. It simply continued forward until it stopped about 30 feet behind the patrol car. The engine shut off. No one got out. Kruger glanced over his shoulder, mildly annoyed. "Your friend?" he asked sarcastically. Ethan looked back. Yes." Kruger smirked. "Well, he's going to have to wait." But then, something else happened. Another pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the street. Another black vehicle, this one larger. and then another. 3 black SUVs now entered the quiet neighborhood, their dark shapes gliding past the parked cars lining the curb. One stopped behind the first, the third parked across the street. Kruger's smirk faded slightly. This wasn't normal. Even Ethan turned slightly, watching them arrive, still calm. But there was something else in his expression now. Expectation. Kruger spoke louder. "All right, that's enough." He pointed toward the sedan. "Turn around! Hands on the car again!" Ethan complied without protest. Across the street, more porch lights flicked on. Neighbors stepped outside. Phones were definitely recording now. Kruger didn't care. He had already committed, but what he didn't realize was that the timing Ethan had mentioned was beginning to matter. The door of the first SUV opened. A man stepped out wearing a dark overcoat. Not a uniform, but not casual either. Behind him, another man exited the second vehicle, then 2 more from the third. 4 men now stood quietly on the street. None of them spoke. None of them approached quickly. They simply walked forward. Measured steps, controlled posture. Kruger watched them out of the corner of his eye. "Stay where you are!" he barked in their direction. The men didn't stop. They kept walking. One of them reached into his coat and briefly displayed something metallic in his hand. A badge. Kruger's chest tightened slightly. Federal? But he still held the authority here. This was his stop. His scene. He turned back toward Ethan. "You call them?" Ethan didn't answer. Kruger stepped closer. "Did you call them?" Ethan's voice remained steady. "No." Kruger gestured toward the approaching men. "Then, what is this?" Ethan paused, then said something simple. "They were already coming." Kruger frowned. That doesn't make any sense. But behind him, the first man had now reached the edge of the police cruiser's flashing lights. He stopped there, not aggressive, not confrontational, just waiting. Kruger turned fully now. "Scene is active," he said sharply. "Stay back." The man nodded once, then spoke in a calm voice. "Officer Kruger?" Kruger stiffened slightly. "How do you know my name?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past him toward Ethan, still standing against the car, still quiet, still patient. Then the man said something that shifted the entire atmosphere of the street. "We've been looking for Mr. Cole." Kruger glanced back at Ethan, then back to the man. "Well, you found him." The man nodded slightly. "Yes." Another pause. Then he added carefully, "And we've been looking for you." Kruger blinked. "What?" The man stepped closer into the flashing red and blue light. Now Kruger could see the badge clearly. Not FBI, not DEA. The insignia was unfamiliar, a dark emblem, minimal markings. Kruger narrowed his eyes. "What agency?" The man answered calmly. "Federal Oversight Division." The name didn't ring any bells. Kruger scoffed. "Never heard of it." The man nodded. "Most people haven't." Behind him, the other agents spread out slightly, not threatening, just present, watching, documenting. Kruger crossed his arms. "Well, congratulations. You've arrived in the middle of a lawful traffic stop, which means you can wait." The man looked at Ethan again, then back at Kruger. "That stop," he said slowly, "is the reason we're here." Kruger felt irritation rising again. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "No," the man replied. "I'm observing how you've been doing it." The words landed heavier than they sounded. Kruger gestured toward Ethan. "He was drifting across the center line." Ethan spoke quietly. "I wasn't." Kruger shot him a glare. "Didn't ask you." The man from the Oversight Division tilted his head slightly. "You're certain about that violation?" Kruger nodded firmly. "Positive?" The man turned slightly and raised his hand. One of the agents behind him opened the back door of the second SUV. Inside were monitors, recording equipment, live feeds, Kruger's brow tightened. The man pointed toward one of the screens. Street camera footage. Another screen. Traffic grid. Another. Patrol overlay. Kruger suddenly felt a small knot forming in his stomach, but he held his ground. Still doesn't change the stop. The man looked back at him. You're correct. It doesn't. Then he added quietly, but it does change what happens next. Kruger's jaw tightened. What's that supposed to mean? The man took another step forward. Officer Kruger. His voice was calm, measured, almost patient. This is the 4th stop we've documented involving you this month. Kruger froze. What? Same pattern. Late night. Minor justification. Extended detainment. Kruger pointed angrily. You're building a case from traffic stops? The man shook his head. No. He glanced at Ethan. From outcomes. Kruger looked confused now. What outcomes? The man let the silence stretch, long enough for the neighbors watching to lean forward, long enough for the tension to tighten. Then he said quietly, the ones that didn't get recorded. Kruger's stomach dropped slightly, but he forced a laugh. You don't have anything. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thin folder, almost identical to the one Kruger had tossed back into Ethan's car earlier. He opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, reports, complaints, internal reviews. Kruger stared at them. What is this? The man flipped to the last page. Tonight was supposed to be observation only. Kruger blinked. Supposed to be? The man looked directly at him now. Then he said something that made the entire street go quiet. But you escalated the stop. Kruger felt the ground shift under his confidence. What are you talking about? The man gestured toward Ethan. You searched property without cause. You detained without probable justification. And you ignored 2 direct advisements. Kruger turned sharply toward Ethan. You set me up. Ethan shook his head calmly. No. Kruger pointed angrily. You're part of this. Ethan met his eyes. I'm part of something larger. Kruger's voice rose. What does that even mean? The man from the oversight division answered instead. It means... He closed the folder slowly. You stopped the wrong car tonight. The silence that followed felt heavy. The flashing lights continued, phones kept recording, and then, from the 3rd SUV, another figure stepped out, this one older, sharper posture, gray suit. He walked slowly toward the scene. When he reached the edge of the flashing lights, every agent straightened slightly. Even the man leading the investigation stepped aside. Kruger watched this carefully. Who the hell is that? No one answered him. The older man stopped directly in front of Ethan. And for the first time, Ethan stepped away from the car, not like a suspect, not like a detained driver, like someone whose part in the waiting was finished. The older man extended his hand. Mr. Cole. Ethan shook it. Director. Kruger's breath caught. Director? Director of what? The man turned slowly toward Officer Kruger. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, very sharp. And then he said the words that finally cracked the entire moment open. Officer Kruger. He gestured lightly toward Ethan. You've just detained the man overseeing federal corruption audits in 12 states. Kruger's face drained of color, but the director wasn't finished. Because the next sentence was the one that would destroy everything. The street had gone completely silent. Even the distant hum of traffic from the highway seemed to fade behind the flashing red and blue lights. Officer Kruger stood frozen beside the gray sedan. Across from him, the older man in the gray suit stepped fully into the rotating light of the cruiser. Up close, his presence carried a quiet gravity, not loud authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. The agents around him shifted slightly, forming a loose perimeter. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just controlled. The director looked at Kruger for a long moment, long enough for the weight of the situation to begin settling into the officer's chest. Then he spoke. "You've just detained the man overseeing federal corruption audits in 12 states. Kruger swallowed. That's not possible. Ethan Cole didn't react. He simply stood beside the car, hands relaxed at his sides. The director continued calmly. His office has been conducting quiet evaluations of municipal authority structures. Kruger blinked. What does that have to do with me? The director tilted his head slightly. Everything. A few of the neighbors watching from their porches whispered to each other. Phones stayed raised, recording. The director glanced briefly toward the street cameras mounted on the nearby utility pole. Then, back to Kruger. Tonight wasn't random. Kruger shook his head. You're telling me this whole thing was some kind of test? No, the director replied. It was observation. He paused. But observation sometimes becomes confirmation. Kruger's voice rose defensively. I followed procedure. The director didn't argue. Instead, he asked a simple question. When you initiated the stop, what was the violation? Kruger answered immediately. Vehicle drift across the center line. The director gestured toward the SUV with the monitors. We reviewed 3 traffic cameras. Kruger's stomach tightened. And, he asked, and the vehicle never crossed the center line. Kruger felt heat rising in his face. Well, maybe the cameras missed it. The director nodded slowly. Perhaps. He stepped a little closer. Then, we checked your body camera. Kruger's breath caught. What? One of the agents behind the director held up a tablet. On the screen was a paused video. Kruger recognized the frame instantly. His own patrol camera. The director spoke gently. You didn't activate it until after you ordered him out of the car. Kruger tried to respond. But the director raised a hand. Before that, he nodded toward another agent. A second video appeared on the tablet, different angle, across the street. A residential security camera. Kruger watched silently as the footage played, his cruiser pulling behind the gray sedan, the stop, the approach, the conversation. The moment he grabbed the folder from the passenger seat. Everything. No body cam, no official record, just raw footage. Kruger looked up slowly. You're pulling footage from private homes now? The director answered calmly. Voluntary cooperation. He nodded toward the houses. These residents received notice 2 weeks ago. Kruger's eyes widened slightly. Notice? 2 weeks? The director continued. Your patrol area was flagged during a pattern review. Kruger's voice cracked slightly. A pattern of what? The director didn't rush the answer. Instead, he glanced briefly toward Ethan, then back to Kruger. A pattern of discretionary escalation. Kruger scoffed, but the confidence was gone now. That's not illegal. No, the director agreed. It isn't. Then he added quietly, but selective escalation can reveal something deeper. Kruger felt the knot in his stomach tightening. You don't know anything about my stops. The director held up the folder again. Inside were pages, lots of them. We know quite a bit. He opened it slowly. 6 complaints in 14 months. Kruger's jaw tightened. Complaints aren't proof. The director nodded. Correct. He turned another page. 3 internal reviews closed without investigation. Kruger's eyes narrowed. That means they found nothing. The director looked at him steadily. Or it means no one looked long enough. Silence spread across the street again. The flashing lights painted everyone in shifting colors. Red, blue, red, blue. Then the director asked another question. When you removed the folder from his vehicle, what made you believe you had the authority to search it? Kruger tried to speak confidently. Officer safety. The director's eyes didn't move. Was the folder a weapon? Kruger hesitated. No. Was it within immediate reach of the driver after he exited the vehicle? Kruger paused again. No. The director closed the folder gently. Then that was an unlawful search. Kruger's throat felt dry. This is ridiculous. Is it? The director asked quietly. Then he gestured toward Ethan again. Do you know why Mr. Cole was here tonight? Kruger shook his head. I don't care. The director's voice remained calm. He was meeting with a city compliance officer. Kruger frowned. For what? The director looked directly into his eyes. To review complaints about this department. Kruger's breath stopped for a moment. You're saying he came here to investigate us? Ethan answered this time. Yes. His voice was steady. No one told us you'd be the first contact. Kruger stared at him. You could have just said who you were. Ethan shook his head slightly. That would have changed the observation. Kruger's voice rose again. So, you let this happen? Ethan didn't flinch. You made your own decisions? The words landed heavier than any accusation. Across the street, someone whispered, "Oh my God!" The director let the silence stretch. Then he spoke again. Officer Kruger. Kruger looked up slowly. Based on tonight's incident and the review findings, the director nodded toward one of the agents. The agent stepped forward holding a document. You are being placed under immediate administrative suspension pending federal review. Kruger's face went pale. You can't do that. The director answered calmly. We already did. Kruger pointed angrily. This is my jurisdiction. The director's response was quiet. And corruption audits are ours. Kruger's voice dropped. You're destroying my career over a traffic stop. The director held his gaze. No. He gestured toward the folder of complaints. Your pattern did that. Another long silence. Kruger looked around the street. Neighbors watching, phones recording, agents standing calmly, Ethan Cole observing quietly. The entire moment unfolding like something he could no longer control. Finally, Kruger spoke again, quieter now. You planned this, Ethan answered gently. No. Kruger shook his head slowly. You knew. Ethan paused, then said something that seemed to settle the entire street. We suspected. The director turned toward the agents. Secure the documentation. 2 agents moved toward the cruiser. Another approached Kruger. Not aggressively, just formally. Kruger didn't resist. He couldn't. Because somewhere deep down, he realized something. This stop had never been about a drifting car. It had never been about a late-night driver. It had been about something far larger. The director turned to Ethan. We'll proceed with the department review tomorrow. Ethan nodded. Understood. They began walking back toward the SUVs, but before Ethan stepped inside the vehicle, he paused and looked back at the quiet neighborhood, at the houses, the cameras, the officer standing beside his cruiser. Then he said something softly, almost to himself. Authority only works when no one is watching. He opened the SUV door. And tonight, he got inside. Everyone was watching. The convoy of black vehicles pulled away slowly. The flashing police lights were the only thing left illuminating the street. And in cities across the country, other quiet reviews were already underway. Because Arlington Heights wasn't the only department under observation.